Oh, thanks very much, Caroline, and thank you to all for being here. It's actually quite intimidating in some ways to speak to this audience, because I always felt I was taking messages from Cape to other places where no one knew me and I could really, tell the stories my way. And this time I have to, I realize there's a slightly more critical audience. And I'm not sure what I learned out there that I can tell you, because you probably know more than I do about most of this. So, and thanks for plugging this book, because it will be something that I come back to a couple of times during the talk. So, I think I did this for George, putting a protected area in the middle of a city where everything natural in that photograph is actually a protected area, and it envelops and it's encompassed by a major city on the African continent. And even though my job is about protected areas in the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, SANBI is a member of IUCN, as is the South African government. There's often a misunderstanding about what protected areas actually are. So I'm hoping to do a couple of things in this talk today. Really building on something that started at the World Parks Congress in Durban in South Africa, when there was a perspective that suggested that South Africans had a new take on how to interpret what is meant by conservation in a developing country, in a transformational society. So this idea of breaking with traditional thinking and catalyzing a new vision is something that was there, and something that's all part of what you do. So what I'd like to do is very, very briefly touch on some global challenges, and to put a context to why I am asserting that 2010 was a pivotal year in conservation and environmental governance generally. Then I want to come back to this issue of protected areas briefly, just so that you're all clear about what I'm talking about. And there are differences of opinion about what protected areas are in the world and why we even call them that. Then I want to spend a bit more time on biodiversity and climate policy, because when I went to the Nature Conservancy, they said, well, what are you going to do here? And I said, well, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that. I think this very interesting connection between what is going on with the world's climate and what is going on with the world's ecosystems, and let's look at what we could do with that. And I've actually been working with a lot of you here and in South Africa on this particular policy issue. And then I want to come back and say, okay, so what is the value proposition for protected areas? And if we're going to run a global program out of Switzerland with all of our country and other members, what should the priorities be? So I'd be interested in your reaction to what priorities are for an international organization. The only thing Swiss about me is I have a Swiss railway clock application that's telling me the time. I don't have an apartment yet. So to start off with, I just wanted to flag the fact that based on the best available evidence of reporting around the world, the Global Biodiversity Outlook that was presented last year in Nairobi ahead of the Nagoya Conference of the Parties, when the world was supposed to report on how we're doing with biodiversity, showed that the status and trends of the components of biodiversity were universally in decline globally. And although there are obviously places where that's not true, the one indicator that was positive was the coverage of protected areas. Now, you shouldn't spuriously make a connection between those two things, but the fact is that the world has actually been putting a huge investment into building the numbers of protected areas, not as fast, although increasingly rapidly in the marine environment, which is still way below where it's supposed to be. But nevertheless, there is still the clear decline in biodiversity status. So everybody stared into 2010 as the year where we're going to account for how we were doing with the 2010 biodiversity target with a bit of skepticism, especially coming out of Copenhagen, which was a complete failure. So staring failure in the face once again. And to boot, when a number of institutes, in this case it's the Stockholm Environmental Institute, Johan Rockström, published a paper in Nature that actually looked at planetary boundaries. I'm not sure whether any of you have been looking at this. This is the biodiversity conservation biology class, but on almost a poll, they looked at a number of different parameters that you could measure how we were doing in terms of what affected the stability of the planet. And of those 9 characteristics, 3 of them were already exceeded in terms of nitrogen, climate change, and the rate of biodiversity loss, and others were at threshold levels. So, you know, the big picture is that the planet is in a state of, you know, does have challenges, and the question is how are we going to meet those challenges, not only to conserve biodiversity, but meet development needs. And we, in this process right now, are heading towards the Rio +20 review of the Millennium Development Goals. How are we doing? And the answer is not particularly well. So to switch modes, I just want to go back and have a look at protected areas. I'm not sure if all of you are aware, but a couple of years ago, after quite a long consultation, IUCN facilitated a process to re-look at the guidelines for applying protected area management categories globally and redefined what a protected area was as this here. So clearly the issue is of a spatial entity that is specifically recognized, dedicated, and managed through whatever means, but to conserve nature and ecosystem services and cultural values. So it's a very broad definition. A lot of people, especially in the United States where I've been living, would think of a protected area as Yellowstone National Park, a bounded off area. People go there as visitors and that's it. But of course, you know that's not true, and that if you look at the full suite of categories of protected areas, you could at one level be looking at very strictly protected areas. I think Prince Edward Islands, for example, are scientific reserve level. We're trying to keep the influence of human beings out. But if you go down to category 6, we're talking about production landscapes where there's if you like, there's sustainable use of natural resources. Predominantly, the fabric of biodiversity is intact and ecosystems are functioning. So it's not a maize field or a wheat field or a vineyard, but it's somewhere in between a totally natural ecosystem and one that is used for production. What isn't really understood, though, and is certainly it's implicit in South African policy and legislation, is about the governance of protected areas, because really only in the last 100 or 150 years have governments taken over responsibility for this function. Generally speaking, areas that are conserved were conserved by people, forests or wetlands or whatever. But governments have stepped in and said, well, we manage these things, and we'll determine the laws and we'll determine the standards. And what has happened is that the principle of what we do, in other words, we manage to conserve biodiversity, needs to be separated from the how we do it, because the private sector, indigenous peoples, local communities, trusts, corporations can all conserve biodiversity in their own way. And you know, many things have been piloted here in South Africa that demonstrate that. But our law is not always interpreted like that. It's interpreted more as government being in charge of this domain. And so if you look at this, the spectrum of different kinds of governance categories, you have down these axes all the different management categories, but across the top, governance by government, shared governance, private governance, indigenous peoples governance. And within that, you could look at community conserved areas or transboundary or local municipality, lots of different formulations of how governance takes place. And I thought our Protected Areas Act in South Africa was quite progressive in that it left the question open. It said a minister can declare something to be a protected area, and he can also declare how it is going to be managed. So, but that hasn't been fully, let's say, exhausted in terms of its application. So I want to just touch on a couple of those types before going on. Shared governance essentially is where accountability is shared between different parties. It might be government and civil society. And it brings in and it invokes another thing. It's about local communities who themselves might identify themselves as being part of that landscape. They're traditional occupiers of a landscape. They revere a site for spiritual purposes. So the identity, the language, the traditions of people might be bound up in the concept of conservation in this case. And similarly with indigenous and community conserved areas, by far the vast area of the world that is untransformed and not, if you like, declared in government systems in particular is in the hands of indigenous and community conserved communities and indigenous peoples, generally referred to as territories because it's a political statement of their, if you like, their rights and obligations regarding land. So I just wanted to touch on those just to give you that flavor. So a system of protected areas wouldn't just protect and conserve and persist in time and space because of the way it's managed, but it would also be, if you like, socially just, cost-effective in terms of its economic setting, and secure in the long term because it's supported generally by a much wider spectrum of stakeholders. And we've seen, and we still have a very strong reaction in Africa and this part of the world towards colonial approaches to conservation that essentially sequestered these resources, put them in the hands of governments, and kept people out. And I think it's time we rehabilitated that and stepped away from it because the world has, and we're still harping on about it. Okay, so to pause and move into a different area. When I started off, I was saying that 2010 was a pivotal year, and 2010 was the year in which the 10th conference of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity was held in Japan, just in October. And no one knew why Japan wanted to host such a conference, given its own record in terms of biodiversity conservation, but nevertheless, they were quite successful in achieving this. And the thing that they achieved was really a triple deal. One of these political games where for 20 years there has never been an agreement on access and benefit sharing for genetic resources. So that's something even SANBI here has grappled with quite a bit. They wanted to look at a new strategic plan for 2020, and they needed the money to actually implement the plan. And so the politics was set up right from the start, saying that unless all of those things happened, none of them would happen. And so until 2 a.m. on the sort of 15th night, the politicians held out for the best possible deal. But, you know, people were quite excited at that point that it actually happened, and those of us who had already gone home, you know, had given up. But nevertheless, the really important issue, I think, for all of us, because it's really that it's a reassertment of the goal to try and halt biodiversity loss, but with a very specific program that goes with it. And the program is set up by the strategic plan that has targets. It's got 5 main goals and it's got 20 targets, and I'm not going to sort of go into all of those with you, but I wanted to just headline a couple of things about them. A target like this, where we're talking about biodiversity values integrated into development and poverty reduction and into national accounting, clearly puts an economic spin on the goal. And of course, Cara, you know, something like this is hugely important. I mean, what's in here is what responds, in fact, leads to something like that and could assist. In fact, SANBI has been named in the strategic plan, or in the process that flows out of this, to be one of the agencies that would assist national governments to actually achieve these targets. Then targets 5 and 10 here, the rate of loss of natural habitats, the pressures on coral reefs, and then invoking the climate change issue here as well comes in. So this target, which is one that's more pertinent to what I'm talking